Hey guys from YouTube, welcome to another video. And in today's video, we're going to watch a truly jaw-dropping match here. Absolutely, for sure, Del World. This match here was played between Magnus Carlsen and David Navara, who is a very strong Czech Grandmaster, okay? And this match here was very surprising. But you might be asking, okay, Raphael, but what was so surprising about this match? Well, watch the video until the end, because I'm sure you'll be just as certain as I am now. And so, without further ado, let's get straight to this brilliant match now. So guys, here we are. And playing white was him, the Norwegian legend Magnus Carlsen against David Navara, the Czech Grandmaster. And Magnus starts here with the move d4, and David chooses to play knight to f6. The game continues with knight to f3, d5, c4, and then e6, preparing here to develop the dark squared bishop. Magnus in this position plays bishop to g5, pinning the knight on f6, then bishop to b4 knight to c3, covering this annoying check, and h6, questioning Magnus's bishop on g5. Magnus here decides to give up the bishop pair, plays bishop, takes f6, queen takes f6, then e3, preparing now to develop the light squared bishop. And in this position, David castles short. The game continues with rook to c1, then the capture of the c4 pawn. Of course, Magnus will recapture this pawn directly with the bishop. Bishop takes c4 and now c5, creating some tension here in the center. David is playing the most solid and technical moves in this position. In this position, Magnus captured the c5 pawn and then comes knight to d7 with the idea of taking this pawn with the knight. Magnus takes advantage of this moment here, castles short, knight takes c5, and then knight to b5. A very interesting move by Magnus because his idea is to play a3, and after bishop to b5, bishop to b4, giving a really annoying fork. David sees this position and plays a6, poking the knight, followed by knight to d4 and then b5. Black is attacking the bishop on c4 here. The bishop goes back to e2 and the game continues with e5. Notice that David keeps making several pawn moves, bothering the pieces of the world champion Magnus Carlsen. In this position, the game continues with knight to d2, and this is a very important move because now David plays a very strong move against Magnus's position. What move was that? It was rook to d8, and notice that in this position, Magnus has no way to defend his queen. Magnus's queen is absolutely trapped. There is no escape for this queen. Did Magnus lose his queen here? Could it be? No, Magnus had calculated this. Here, Magnus is going to make a positional queen sacrifice. It's very complex, very difficult. And at the end, I'll show the game report. You'll be extremely surprised by the sequence of moves Magnus ends up making in this game. So after rook to d8, yes, Magnus sacrifices the queen. He plays knight takes b4. Of course, there were other options if the guy didn't want to lose his queen right away, right? The desperate move would be to play knight to d2 or knight to d4, giving up a piece, right? But that wasn't Magnus's idea. Sacrificing the queen here is a great idea. Magnus played here with knight takes b4, and the game continued with rook takes d1, of course, right? Rook from f takes d1, and now black has the knight under threat. David defends capturing the knight by attacking another white piece with a5, poking the knight. Magnus avoids simplifying pieces after giving up the exchange and plays n5. The game continues with qd6, then ank c4 with Magnus already finding tactics. The idea is that if black takes here, the knight on e4, then rook takes c5 is Magnus's idea. And notice that the rook becomes super active, and the pawn on b5 is also hanging. It's practically impossible for black to defend everything here. So in this position, David didn't want to capture this knight on e4, although it was an option. Not as good as it is here. David played bb7, attacking the knight on d5. Magnus responded with bf3, defending the knight. The game continues with rook to c8 and knight to g4. Notice the world champion's cunning. This move is threatening. Magnus is threatening to play knight from d to f6 to win the queen. David saw Magnus's move and played queen f8 to defend his queen. Magnus then played h4. Magnus, as we know, one of his great specialties is endgames, and that's what he's going to try to convert in this game. So the positional queen sacrifice is a very difficult sacrifice to understand. But it makes perfect sense. And Magnus is going to prove that in this game. With his moves, the game continues with knight to 7, proposing the exchange of rooks here. Magnus agrees to exchange rooks. Rook captures on c8. And of course, black can't capture with the queen, because then there's knight to e7, which would lose the queen. And this is an interesting idea from Magnus to trade the rooks, because it forces black to take with the bishop. And notice that the bishop once again goes back to a very passive square, the original square of the bishop. Magnus continues with a3. The game follows with h5 attacking the knight, which moves to h2 to defend. David plays g6, then Magnus responds with b2, attacking the b5 pawn. And in this position, David decides to play dynamically. He doesn't try to defend this pawn at all. He plays here with knight c5. Magnus asks, "You give me a pawn." He takes the pawn, and bishop takes on bishop 5. The move was played, capturing a pawn in the process. Bishop to h7 pokes the knight, aiming to simplify further. Magnus counters with knight to c3, halting that plan. The game proceeds with a queen move, e7. David, of course, is now poking at the pawn on h4, and improving his queen's position. And Magnus will have to prove that this exchange sacrifice really makes sense. So here, Magnus is going to defend the h4 pawn with a move rook to d4, bringing the rook to the defense. Queen to a6 was played. The game continues with knight to f1 and queen to b3. An intriguing move that targets the b2 pawn, forcing Magnus to defend it. He returns the rook to d2, and the game proceeds with knight to c4. And at this moment, it's a tense situation because, look closely, the knight is attacking the rook and also the b2 pawn. And Magnus here wouldn't want to give up the bishop for the knight because that would simplify the position even more. So Magnus found another very interesting line here, continuing with rook d7. Notice that the main point is that he's attacking the bishop here, and there's no way to defend this bishop. The bishop doesn't have any square where it can be defended, okay? Because if the bishop goes back to any of the squares on the last rank, there's a check coming, and the bishop will end up being lost. There's no way to defend it. So David had already seen this. He played here with the knight takes b2, now removing the defense of the knight on c3. Magnus played rook takes b7, queen takes c3, followed by bishop to e8, aiming to win another pawn. Be cautious. Losing too many pawns can be problematic. The game proceeds with king to f8, bishop takes f7, then queen to c6, attacking the rook, which defends the bishop and can't leave it unprotected. Rook takes b2 was played, winning a piece but leaving the bishop unprotected. The knight fell and king takes f7. Now rook to d2. In this position, Magnus has a knight and rook against a queen. However, he has 2 extra pawns. And it's very complicated for black to play a position like this. It will only be, and only if, Magnus saw this position many moves ago. I don't know, I have no idea. I think only Magnus can answer that question, right? However, this position is intriguing for white, who is a legend in endgames. The game continues with queen to a4 already looking to take a pawn, but Magnus won't allow it. He played rook to d3 and queen takes h4, a double attack. However, Magnus has an interesting idea here in this position. He plays rook to d7, and after king to g8 comes the move rook to d4. Dislodging the queen from this square, interesting, right? And he's going to block and defend the pawn on a3 because after the move, queen to e7, poking at this little pawn, comes a4. And notice that the queen side is completely defended, and Magnus has an extra pawn. There are 3 here, right? 3 pawns against 2, and he's going to create a very interesting and also very threatening defensive system against black's position. The game continues here with queen to a3, and now g3, creating an escape square here for the king. Soon after, Magnus starts improving his pieces significantly. The g3 move provides 2 escape squares for the king and prevents some pawn advances on black's king side. Queen to 1 pins the knight. Magnus plays king to g2. The game continues with g5 as Navara wants to play g4, trapping the white king completely. Magnus plays knight to d2 in a Grob-style opening with g4 on the board. Despite Magnus's king being completely locked in, he remains calm. Magnus's idea is that this pawn will end up becoming vulnerable in some cases. He'll try to bring the knight to f4 to keep poking around that area. The game continues with e4, followed by a surprising qc1 move from David. David allowed the knight to f6, threatening the pawn on h5. He seems to be trying to force a draw, likely feeling disadvantaged. Magnus played king to f7, and the knight took the h5 pawn. The situation is worsening for David, with the g4 pawn, known as the Grob pawn, now vulnerable. The rook is attacking directly, right? I'll play queen. To c6 check, Magnus plays king to g1 queen to c1. David is trying to repeat the position, because if the king goes back to g2 queen to c6 again, trying to force a draw. But Magnus surprises everyone when he says, no, I don't want to draw this position. He plays king to h2, going on the attack, right? The game continues. King to e6, attacking the knight, knight to f4, king to f6, and now knight to d2. Magnus is going to start working this endgame with a lot of mastery, and we're going to understand what's happening here. The game continues with king to e5. David here is defending his pawn that was under attack, so rook to fe4. David here played the move queen to e1 queen to d1, bringing another defender to the pawn. Magnus here plays knight to h4, and notice that there could also be ideas like rook to e5, and this little pawn here is hanging. That would be an even bigger problem, right? Because it would push the a-pawn. So David, in this position, plays queen to c2, bringing a defense to this square. I'm not sure if that's viable, right? If Magnus plays rook to f5 now, I think it would be possible, right? I think rook to 5 ends up drawing maybe king to h6. Rook takes on h5, and now the f2 pawn is falling, right? Rook takes on a5, and the f2 pawn falls. That's the main idea. David defended against those ideas. Magnus kept playing f5, improving his knight further. The game resumed with the move queen to d3. Then e4. This is a move that really surprised me, okay? Because Magnus, he's trying to push the e-pawn, which is pretty crazy, at least for me, right? It seems like he's going to jeopardize his own position, but he won't. This move is very interesting. It starts to create more problems for Black's position. The game continues here with queen to d7. Notice that David immediately attacks the pawn on a4 because it's not defended. So e5, played by Magnus, keeps advancing the pawn and also defends the little pawn on a4. The queen sacrifice themes for rook and knight don't work because Magnus has more pawns in this endgame, so that would be a problem for Black. David played queen to h7. Checking the king on g1. Magnus avoids any check themes because if he plays king to g2, queen to b7 could force a draw again. So king to g1 queen to g6, followed by the move knight to d6. Oops, Magnus is preparing some interesting knight maneuvers here. The game continued with queen to e6, and this was a serious mistake by David. This queen to e6 because it allows a very beautiful combination here by Magnus in this endgame, which starts with the move rook to f5. Notice the strength of this move because now the Black king only has two squares where he can go h6 and g6. And for either of these two squares, king to g6 and rook to f6 wins instantly as you must sacrifice the queen, resulting in a lost endgame. A pawn down and a knight. So what did David do after rook to f5? He had to give up the queen for the knight and the rook. So queen takes f5, knight takes f5, king takes f5. And in this position, Magno played here with f4, bringing a defense to the pawn here on e5. But of course, as we know, there's this special move called en passant, where Black can capture this pawn here that jumped two squares. Squares straight on the first move. So the capture comes here from the f3 pawn. King f2 king. King f2 king takes e5, and now king f3, followed by king f5 and king e3. In this position, yes, ladies and gentlemen, Magnus Carlsen wins the game. David Navara resigns in this position because there's no way to hold on anymore. This pawn endgame, okay? Magnus is now clearly trying to bring his king to capture the a5 pawn, while the Black king is coming to take the g3 pawn. And when that happens, this little pawn here will end up promoting unstoppably. There's nothing that can be done. And the most surprising thing is what I'm going to show now. Let me pull up the game report here so you can see something. Take a look at the report from this unbelievable match. Magnus Carlsen made a positional queen sacrifice and had a 99.3% accuracy. And David played really well too, 97.8%. So Magnus in this game, he's a real engine. There's no arguing with that. There's no way to contest it. Look, he didn't have a single inaccuracy, no mistakes, no blunders, no missed wins. He played 48 best moves, 7 excellent moves, and 2 good moves with 7 book moves. It's unbelievable how this kid plays. This game here is a pretty famous one from Magnus, okay? With this incredible sacrifice because he sacrificed the queen at the beginning of the game without a clear and immediate gain, and he ended up converting it brilliantly in the end. I hope you enjoyed this game. Guys, if you liked it, don't forget to leave a big like down below, and see you in the next videos. Thanks, everyone. Subtitles by Adriana Zanato.